Okay, well, welcome back everyone from a quick break, although I think most of you took the opportunity to meet the speakers from a previous panel discussing the pros and cons and potential of autonomous vehicles and what contribution they can make to a sustainable and fair mobility system. I think that was a really interesting topic. We had wonderful different perspectives, a lot of food for thought. And now it's time for us to unpack the next topic, the topic of virtual mobility, which I think right now it's all very dear to our hearts. I'm pretty sure that you, like me, were not necessarily expecting 2 years ago that we'd all be so fluent in Teams and Zoom and WebEx. But here you are. Sometimes these kinds of opportunities can be hidden in something otherwise very sad, like a pandemic. And of course, it offers wonderful new possibilities for people from all around the world to connect with very low transaction costs. So we're going to begin this session with a wonderful keynote speaker. And after that, we have an international expert panel to deepen the discussion further. And of course, as always, we will do questions and answers with the audience. So keep that energy up. I saw a lot of really great comments and insights and ideas into the chat, and that's wonderful. I look forward to seeing more of that this afternoon. So now, without further ado, I would like to welcome our keynote speaker of the day. She's Portzheimer Professor of Science and Technology Studies at the Harvard Kennedy School and authored many exciting books relating to the topic of today's conference, Can Science Make Sense of Life and the Ethics of Invention, and much more. Let's welcome Professor Sheila Yasanov.
Thank you very much, Alina, for that kind introduction, and thank you to Martin and others from the Humboldt Foundation for inviting me to speak in this gathering on a topic which, Alina, as you say, is close to everybody's practices, if not always to our hearts. You know, it's something that we were thrust into in a rather shocking way, but then we have made our way into it. So I want to talk a little bit about the pros and the cons. And I should say that my academic background is in the law. So I want to bring in that dimension as well when we talk about mobility. I suppose I am authorized to share my screen. And if so, let me try to do that right now. Okay, so I have a few slides just to anchor what I'm going to say and on this topic of virtual mobility. So let's begin with a kind of conceptual starting point. I mean, one reason that we are all so fluent and adept is that this idea of virtuality has been breeding for a very long time. And this is Apple's home in Cupertino, but overlaid by a sort of sloganeering quotation. Sorry, let's keep that slide back there. A quotation that everybody in Silicon Valley knows, which has to do with virtuality. It's a mindset, not a location. So if we think of location as being the opposite of mobility, the entire Silicon Valley ethos has been geared in a sense to denying the significance of location. And one of the things I want to suggest is that we, if we're interested in concepts like sustainability and equality, should be skeptical. We should be skeptical of any ideological claims, and this is, in a sense, an ideological claim. It's worth pointing out that in the heartland of Silicon Valley, San Francisco and the Bay Area are beset with a lot of problems that very much have to do with location. So today, for instance, is the recall vote on California's governor. And one of the reasons for this recall vote has to do with the localization of politics within the state. It has to do with the environmental problems that California is suffering. And above all, it also has to do with the homelessness problems that have become intensified in the Bay Area. So when Silicon Valley goes around preaching to all of us that its products have made us into a mindset over location civilization, I think we should take that with a grain of salt. Nevertheless, of course, there are benefits and there are ways in which the global spread of ideas has been working in various ways. So this is from fairly recent article about the COVID vaccines, and it has particular bearing for Germany, but also for the world. So the COVID vaccines are a triumph of what? Of globalization, by the way, predating the pandemic itself. But why? And in the article, it talks about the fact that the major, one of the major vaccines, the Pfizer-BioNTech, is a product of multiple lines of crossing and mobility throughout the world. So BioNTech, a German company with an office in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I live, founded by a Turkish couple living in Germany, one of them an immigrant, and then in collaboration with a multinational that is based in New York. And it's again worth pointing out that this particular multinational was not relying on the US government for its support, whereas some other vaccine development in America did rely on American governmental support. So this is a story that is through and through about mobility. Whether it's virtual mobility or not is a sort of separate concern, but some of the ways in which we're working ourselves out of the crisis have to do with the spread of mobility in our world and the ways in which it hooks up to produce benefits. Coming closer to home for myself, because I work in the domain of ideas, since last April or so, I've been conducting a major study of responses to the COVID crisis in all of these countries, in Asia, in Europe, in North and South America, and in Australia. There is absolutely no way that I could have conducted this study without virtual platforms and their availability. So we call that study CompCore, for comparative COVID response. And the participants are on 5 continents. They are in 16 core countries and 2 affiliates in 39 institutions, and it involves 59 researchers, so almost 60 researchers. And we've been able to have meetings almost every other month. We've been able to have drill down meetings with people from different research teams. We've been able to keep people on track in a common shared research protocol. This is by far the largest collaboration I personally have been involved in. And ironically, or maybe not ironically, it has come up exactly at the moment when my personal interactions with all of these people have been dissolved. I mean, so this group includes a number of my close friends whom I haven't seen in 2 years, but we've been able to keep alive this collaboration. So again, both the vaccine development story and my personal story as a research manager and as a major international researcher very much have to do with the positive sides of virtual mobility. But the positive sides are not the only side. So one reason that a person like myself has been able to keep afloat and not really to suffer many evil consequences of the last 18 months is that there is this large corporation known as Amazon that brings things to my doorstep. And this is a picture of Amazon's warehouse in JFK Airport. But there, it's not virtual, right? I mean, the cardboard boxes are by no means virtual. And this is from a New York Times article written in June of this year about Amazon's own workforce. So it turns out that Amazon is much better at managing cardboard boxes than it is at managing people. And I picked out just one paragraph from this interesting article. In contrast to its precise, sophisticated processing of packages, Amazon's model for managing people, heavily reliant, and I think some of our other distinguished guests will pick up on some of these items, heavily reliant on metrics, apps, and chatbots was uneven and strained even before the coronavirus arrived, and more so now after. That same article points out the substantial difference, since one of the issues we're exploring is egalitarianism. and fairness in collaboration. Note that the workers' breakdown by ethnic minorities and by color is extraordinarily different for the professional class and for the laboring class. So look at the tranche of the Black population in the manual laboring class as opposed to in the professional class, and just the differences in the different color codings. So this workforce, the virtually mobile workforce, is not equally mobile inside of itself. This gigantic company that has managed to keep us going, many of us going in a time of virtuality, is itself reliant on that sort of problem. And now that we're emerging out of the pandemic, it turns out that the labor market is undergoing enormous shifts that none of us, I think, has the prescience to be quite able to figure out. But it's clear that job losses are occurring because people do not want to go back to the same kinds of jobs that they were doing. And this is going to affect mobility questions looking into the future as well. I want to throw in a couple of other complicating factors just to open up the discussion that we're moving into. So one of them is the fact that, science has claimed to be a republic for a very long time, but what keeps the republic of science going? It's that the ideas land into various things. I mean, so this is a Chinese propaganda kind of billboard, but it reminds us that there are national ideologies and claims lying back of the kinds of mobility issues we're talking about. Nation states have not disappeared just because we can talk to each other in the ways that we're doing now. I told a couple of people that I was going to be, quote, in Germany, unquote, this morning. But, the fact that my communications are crossing national boundaries is not an entirely innocent phenomenon. And one bumps up against different forms of epistemic claims. And I just want to put on the table that how these epistemic claims relate to each other is itself a theoretically interesting question. Do we allow different forms of knowledges, different forms of claims to coexist side by side with each other? Do we require a degree of cosmopolitanism where we're going to harmonize the ways in which we generate knowledge? If Pfizer is going to make a vaccine, whose clinical trial regime is going to be enforced there? I mean, these are kinds of issues that are often in the back of our mobility questions. So let me conclude by saying that it's not just a kind of celebratory Silicon Valley as a mindset kind of point that we should be taking home, but we should recognize that mobility itself has infrastructures, and those infrastructures may not be entirely mobile, like JFK5 or whatever that Amazon warehouse is called. There are infrastructures underlying our mobility. And one can therefore start saying that for virtual collaboration to be workable, you need to pay attention to the infrastructures that exist. So my particular very successful productive collaboration depended on an enormous amount of prior social groundwork. Collaboration works very well when the status differentials among people are not huge. When the subject matter is not controversial, it doesn't affect things like national security or sovereignty. When intellectual property issues are not dominant or at stake. And then in terms of the infrastructures, which are not themselves mobile, we depend on human collaborations. I know this is a point you want to come back to later, Alina. We depend on material collaborations. So this morning I was talking to colleagues and one of them said he was having deep internet problems. And yesterday I had very frustrating internet problems. So it's not that the virtuality is based on a virtual infrastructure. By no means. There's a material infrastructure. There is an informational infrastructure. There is a temporal infrastructure. Time zones matter. And there is a legal infrastructure. So I think that with that, let me conclude this introductory opening up of the territory, reminding us that virtuality only exists because the non-virtual precedes it, interpenetrates with it, and is significant as well.
Thank you so much for that input. Sheila, very important topics that you're mentioning, and I love how you broke it down into these different spheres as well. I learned a lot. What I would love to hear from you is, you mentioned that you do all this wonderful international work with researchers, some of them are friends, virtually now, of course, because of the pandemic, and that worked well because you got to do that social groundwork beforehand and connect with these people in person and really build these networks up. And I think that's a very important element of research exchange and cooperation. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, virtual is probably going to be a format that's going to be around for a long time. And it's a very important element in how we communicate. Also, if you're considering sustainability. But how do we kind of nurture these important professional and personal networks that need to thrive in person usually? And you know, how do we weigh these things out, especially for people who are a little bit further in the career, who already have these networks? It might be easier to decide, but for young people who are still building that, you know, how do we deal with that challenge?
Well, I think that one of the things everybody has discovered is that there is no substitute for the real. So we're back to teaching in person at Harvard now, and even the undergraduates, so one of my students said that since graduating from high school a year and a half ago, she has not stepped into a classroom, and they are much more energized than I've seen them in a while. I mean, usually Harvard undergraduates are pretty blasé. They work very hard to get here, and now they think they need a holiday. But you can feel that they just have not had the personal interactions in a while. We're still wearing masks outdoors, not outdoors, but in classrooms and so forth. Nevertheless, there is a kind of energy to the coming back together again that is palpable. I mean, so I think we have to find out different kinds of ways. So one of the things I'm emphasizing is that virtuality is not multi-directional. I mean, some of us have the resources to be virtual, others do not. So one of the things we have to be concerned about is how we extend the values of virtuality. One of the things I've done in my own program is to add a layer of virtual activities, and which we intend to maintain. And it's actually been extremely good in overcoming barriers of time and barriers of space. So people who've been through my program, 15 years ago, they are now attending these virtual programs, which they would not be able to do otherwise. And it's re-networking people. So it's creating a kind of generational effect, which I think did not exist before in a sense, and how to capitalize on that. I mean, it still requires my infrastructure and my sort of overlooking capacity. So I think interactivity, the switching back and forth between modalities and how to capitalize on those possibilities. It may be possible, for instance, to have largely virtual interactions for a year if you have an intensive one-week collaboration, which could still be much more sustainable than flying back and forth 12 times in the course of the year. I mean, one would have to think about how these collaborations exist and how they can be turned around so that the global South to the global North is represented in a more prominent way, and not just global North to global South. I mean, sort of these, how does one turn arrows around, space arrows and time arrows? I think these are, seriously intellectually challenging questions, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what my colleagues have to say about them as well.
Yes, thank you very much. You're right. This is intellectually very challenging. It's a bit of a cost-benefit analysis. I like your hybrid solution of like an intensive week of collaboration and like in-person bonding, and then working long distance as an option. Like you said, let's hear what the other panelists have to say. Thank you very much for this input. I look forward to connecting again in the discussion. So as always, for our experts in the panel, you will be doing a short input talk from up to 5 minutes, and we're going to do them back to back and then take all of the questions and comments from the participants at the end in a joint discussion round. As a quick FYI, at 4.5 minutes in, I'm going to make this short little sound so that you know that you have about 30 seconds left to wrap up. And participants, as always, loving your energy and your enthusiasm. Please keep adding questions to the chat. I will do my very best to integrate them. So yeah, then let's welcome our first panelist, Astrid Eichhorn. She is Associate Professor in Theoretical Physics at the University of Southern Denmark in Odense, and also speaker of the German Young Academy. Thank you so much for joining us, Astrid.
Thanks, Annika. It's a pleasure to be here, and try to limit my remarks to under 4 minutes. So internationalization and international collaboration in science has, of course, really long been equated with physical mobility. And this has also resulted in significant physical mobility requirements as a part of a successful career in science. And I think it's also an interesting question whether that actually leads to some brain drain from science. During the last decade, and in particular during the last year, we have actually seen that virtual formats do enable internationalization and international collaboration. And I would argue that they even increase diversity and opportunities for participation across the globe. So for instance, scholars and scientists from the global south are often excluded from in-person meetings just because of the lack of travel funds and the complications and costs of visa applications. Similarly, researchers with family or with care responsibilities are often de facto excluded from in-person meetings. So that's a first argument for an increase in virtual mobility. Virtual mobility is really critical in my view for a second reason, and that's the climate crisis. So we do need a swift and transformative change across all sectors of society. And I don't think that academia is a special sector of society, and therefore greenhouse gas emissions in academia must be cut down to zero as quickly as in other sectors. And physical mobility might, of course, still be necessary in some situations in academia, but I think we can now develop new climate-friendly and also internationally more inclusive formats of virtual mobility. And of course, big transformations, such as this transformation from virtual to physical mobility, they are not without challenges. And I'd just like to very briefly address some of them and share some of my thoughts, focusing on one particular aspect of virtual mobility, namely virtual conferences. So over the last year, I think we've all heard concerns that online formats make networking more difficult, that somehow serendipitous encounters are much less likely to happen, that sort of in short, something is missing from virtual conferences. And of course, there is Zoom fatigue. And I don't disagree with any of that, but I think much of it is because we're at the beginning of a process. So as a scientific community, I think we're only just have started to learn how to really make use of online communication and virtual mobility. And there are still a lot of aspects that we just need to adapt to. And also in that process, we need to take into account that it's not always a good idea to just take something from an in-person format and just try to transfer it into the virtual world. Instead, we can actually use new formats that are only accessible online. So just to be very specific, for instance, random pairing of participants in breakout rooms is actually a much less hierarchical way of networking than often at in-person conferences, where it can be quite difficult, maybe for a PhD student to actually approach an established senior researcher. Or things like anonymous question forums also lower the threshold for participation and just enhance the inclusivity of online formats. I think there are overall quite a few new tools that we can use online to make meetings more inclusive and to enable interactions in a less hierarchical way. But I do think that for that, we all need to be sort of brave and experiment a little bit more. And in that context, I think it's also important to keep in mind that maybe the in-person conference formats we had before the pandemic were not always the most successful in actually achieving their goals. Just think of a conference room where there's a speaker in front and everybody in the audience sits there and is reading their emails and not actually participating in the scientific exchange. So we now have the chance to redevelop new and better formats than that. And I think in order for that to succeed, we have to be willing to accept that in the beginning, things will be more difficult, that in the beginning, not everything will be perfect. And we have to dare to experiment a little bit. And if we do that, then I'm hopeful that we can actually develop a more climate friendly and more inclusive way of virtual mobility. For that, to enable this change of culture in the academic community, I think the support from funding organizations is critical, because they do set a lot of the incentives for either physical or virtual forms of mobility. And so I'm really happy to be discussing here at the invitation of the Humboldt Foundation on that question of virtual mobility. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing what the others have to say and to hearing the questions from the audience.
Thank you very much, Astrid. It was very interesting food for thought. Also, you're right, there is an opportunity here as well, and it's all very new. That's absolutely correct. It feels like it's been years now, but it is still a fairly new phenomena. So that's a lot to consider and to unpack. I also agree, maybe the former kind of conference that I'm kind of glorifying in a way, because I miss in-person contacts, we're not always very efficient either. So definitely room for improvement. So yes, let's take that into the discussion round and welcome our next panelist. That would be Dr. Abdullahi Yusuf, who is a senior lecturer at the Department of Zoology and Entomology at the University of Pretoria. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, Abdullahi.
Thanks, Annika, and thanks to all the panelists, especially the colleagues here. So let me start off on a different note. So my take is that when we discuss topics like this, there's the need to look at and consider the specificity of different regions of the world. So I would not want to use the popular words or terms global south, nor the term developing world, as both are subjective. So in discussions like this, peculiarities from such geographies should be looked at, because for some of us, mobility, especially for research, has never been for leisure, but that of necessity. And most of you would agree with me that as scientists, we are one of the considerate groups in the way that we handle the environment, as well as open to trying new things, even getting out of our comfort zones. So the pandemic has made doing things virtually the new norm. I would say a norm which is here to stay, at least some elements of it, I hope. So going virtual will definitely change the way we work, meet, and conduct research. Things like travel for collaboration need to be thought through, especially with changes in policy across institutions and funders, where you need a lot of motivation these days for you to travel. Also, we have to look at it from the fact that brain gain, so I'm using the alternative term used by my colleague here, brain gain instead of brain drain, need to be motivated beyond reasonable doubts, which was a bit much more easier before. So we need to extend also the awareness in terms of the merits and demerits, or the need for virtual mobility and in-person mobility to the wider society in general, which is our responsibility. So one way to do this, I would say, is that we should look at something that we have forgotten. So things like exploring indigenous knowledge systems, because there is a lot of knowledge in indigenous knowledge in the way to look at and at the environment. So on terms of the impact, so the thing is that regions that have good infrastructure had ease in transition when we went into the pandemic, whereas regions of the world that have inadequate infrastructure were challenging, and that will continue to be if we say we're going to stick to virtual mobility. And also we have to look at things like the social nature of the different regions and the social nature of us as human beings. We still need that element of in-person interaction. And also we have to look at the psychology of it in terms of maintaining our own well-being. So in terms of how to collaborate fairly, sustainably, and creatively in the future, so since we have experience, or we're experiencing the use of virtual platforms, their merits and demerits, in my view, a hybrid model should be explored, one which provides some degree of in-person interactions and the option of participating virtually to allow those who cannot travel participate. Such can be facilitated by limiting travels, maybe to in-region, where large meetings are hosted with local participants at one point and satellite ones at different places simultaneously. But when we do this, we have to also look at the problems of time zone and see how we can synchronize it. If there is time, I can give examples of this. So in my experience, adopting a hybrid model, it's easy, not without its challenges, because there are networks that we can use for such. So in summary, I would say we should follow in the footsteps of people like Alexander von Humboldt, whom during their time, he has the opportunity to travel for luxury to all the parts of the world, but yet he chose to travel only for knowledge and the benefits of the society. Thank you. That's all from my side.
Thank you very much, Abdullahi. That's a very great comments and insights, especially the fact that we need to consider the regional differences and make sure that these new formats are tailored to make sure that everybody gets the most out of it in a fair and accessible way. We're going to dive deeper into this during the discussion round. Thank you so much for joining us. I would love to welcome now our next and final panelist to the virtual stage. That will be Florenta Teodoridis, Assistant Professor of Management and Organization at the University of Southern California, Marshall School of Business. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, Florenta.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and learn from everyone about virtual mobility. I certainly learned a lot and I look forward to the discussion. Just to add a bit about me, I'm focusing in my research mostly on the economics of innovation. So I assume one of the reasons I was invited to speak here is because in my research, I precisely try to understand the process of knowledge creation. So how individuals can come together and combine existing knowledge in order to create new knowledge. So in essence, when we talk about collaboration, we're talking about a search process of how we can find new pieces of information and bring those ideas together. It's interesting to me when I think about virtual mobility that it's not a new phenomenon. So I suggest that we should think about virtual mobility as an aspect that it's not necessarily new. In a way, it's super new. In a way, it's not. There's a lot written in economics of innovation about the role of the internet. And I would like to start there. So I know a number of you might be too young probably to remember the pre-internet academia, but there was a time when we didn't even have email, right? So any collaboration was done via phone calls that were quite expensive across borders and in-person conferences. When the internet arrived, of course, we started to take advantage of this democratization of communication, which was brought up by my fellow panelists, which opened opportunities to communicate across borders and enable certain regions of the world that were otherwise not in a position to travel at various conferences to connect with people across borders. I view the virtual communication that is happening right now as another Internet 2.0 in a way, in which we have even an additional opportunity to increase the intensity of this democratization of participation in the process of knowledge creation. So one aspect of it is this discussion that was already brought that virtual communication is democratizing, is allowing various people and regions of the world to participate in the process of knowledge creation in a more collaborative way, in ways that perhaps just physical travel was not enabling. In addition to increasing the breadth of individuals that can participate in the innovation process, it also might increase the frequency. If we think about it, if we are to travel in person, it's only so many conferences one can attend due to various cost restrictions, be it monetary cost restrictions or time opportunity cost restrictions and things like that. In virtual environments, although we do feel the Zoom fatigue, it is reasonable to participate in more conferences. I mean, look at me right now, I'm in Los Angeles. It's 6 a.m. here, and most of you, from what I understand, are in Germany. I promise you it would have been impossible for me to travel there for this panel. So it's an amazing opportunity for me to get to meet so many people with such a low cost, right? I just woke up early today, basically. That's my cost, rather than flying 12 hours across the world. So things like this, although it's Zoom fatigue, the Zoom fatigue needs to be taken with a grain of salt of what else, what would have been the outside opportunity for that, what would have been the alternative. Obviously, I mean, the issue with helping with climate change was discussed, so I'm not going to go there. In the 5 minutes, we can discuss more in the Q&A. So I'm going to focus on one aspect of this that I think it's important. In my research, I spent quite a bit of time discussing about the different types of individuals that are involved in the process of knowledge creation. That means we are not all the same. Some of us are more preoccupied to dig deep in a niche of research and be more specialized. Others are more social creatures. They prefer to dig around different areas of research and increase their breadth of research. So in my own studies, I find that the process of knowledge creation, so innovation, benefits from having individuals that are also interested in this increase in breadth, but also individuals that have a lot of depth. So we can think of this virtual mobility as affecting people differently. Individuals that like to increase their breadth, like I said, might be benefited from sampling different Zoom meetings and meeting people that way. They might also be disadvantaged because they take their information from in person. Individuals that are more specialized, I guess, and individuals that don't quite take so much energy from social interactions would be in an advantaged position by being able to attend Zoom. So in other words, I mean, this is a deeper discussion that I don't have time to go into 5 minutes, but in other words, I think it's important to understand that we are not all the same. Not all of us benefit from direct social interactions with the same intensity, and not all of us thrive in the virtual environment similarly, right? So it's important to understand what is the balance in which us as individuals are most efficient in what we are doing, and be able to have a menu of options of conferences that are in person and virtually to choose from in order to achieve our personal best, our personal efficiency. I'm not sure how much more time I have, but I guess it's a good point perhaps to stop right here and discuss more in Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much, Florenta. That's a really great, like you said, points to end it. I think that was a great insight also with optimism in it. You know, like you said, it wouldn't have been very easy for you to join us from LA if it wouldn't have been thanks to this virtual format. So there's definitely pros and cons. I think it also links to what Sheila Yasanov put in the chat, to move away from the binary good or bad. There's pros and cons, and everybody's different. So there's pros and cons that feel different for each of them. I personally love in-person meetings, but you know, that's me. And I know a lot of my introverted colleagues actually love that there's also this option now that just didn't really exist in any kind of mainstream way 3 or 2 years ago.